Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our next webinar in a series that we call Learn at Home, which is brought to you by the University of Rhode Island's College of the Environment and Life Sciences, and in particular, Cooperative Extension, which is the entity I am here tonight representing. My name is Kate Venturini. I am a extension educator with Extension in Rhode Island. Very pleased to be joined by my colleague, Christopher Reilly, who will tell you a little bit more about himself as we move forward. But tonight's webinar is called Managing Rhode Island's Forests to Combat and Adapt to Climate Change. Real nice, light topic. Which I'm sure you'll all enjoy. And as I mentioned, for those of you joining us live, feel free to share where you're joining us from and the nearest forest to where you sit. I am here very near to Patuxent State Forest here in West Greenwich. Next slide, please, Chris. So as I mentioned, Cooperative Extension is a part of the College of the Environment and Life Sciences at the University of Rhode Island. We at Cooperative Extension are responsible for bringing the science-based university resources to Rhode Island's people and communities. What that means is that we, as extension educators, basically translate the scientific findings from URI and other institutions into messaging that folks who don't have extensive training in these topics can understand, really. And so we pride ourselves on bringing science out to people. We do that around 5 different strategic areas of focus. And I think tonight's presentation falls squarely within the first one there, which is land stewardship. But many of our programs do center on food systems and agriculture, water resources, energy literacy, and healthy lifestyles. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we were forced really to start to offer our educational programs online. And that has allowed us to reach many more people in the comfort of their own home. And so this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube. So if you have friends who are forest enthusiasts or owners or protectors, please do share this with them. We would very much appreciate that. We want to make sure the information is in the hands of the people who need it, regardless of their ability to be here tonight. So thank you. Next slide. Just a few housekeeping items. There is a Q&A box. If you click in the very bottom right-hand corner of the screen, there are 3 dots. When you click that, it'll open a Q&A. You can enter questions for Christopher there. I will bring them to his attention at the end of his presentation. And there's also a chat. You really can enter questions in both places, but the Q&A is nice because we can monitor answers and things. So please don't hesitate to ask questions that are relevant to today's talk. Also, you will be sent an email automatically when the webinar is over. It'll come from an email address, something like messenger@webex. There's a survey link there, and it will take you less than 2 minutes, I promise. We send surveys to gather feedback on not only the content of the program, but also the format and your dear proctor's performance. That's me. So we really do read all the responses to those surveys, and thank you in advance for taking the time to fill it out. And lastly, as I mentioned, this session will be posted on our Extension YouTube channel. You can find that just by using a search engine and typing in URI Cooperative Extension YouTube. All of our webinars are closed captioned for the hearing impaired, and you will find literally a treasure trove of locally relevant topics on the YouTube channel that we've been offerings since May of 2020. So please do search through there. There's a lot of different science-based information, and it's all for you. So take advantage of it. So next slide. I think the only other thing I'll mention before we get started is that this presentation will be followed by a Q&A. And we do have 2 or 3 more webinars this summer coming up on alternate Tuesdays. So check those out on the web. And until Chris is done, I'm going to turn it over to him. Don't forget about the Q&A and the chat function, folks. And without further ado, I present to you Mr. Christopher Reilly, our resident forestry expert.
Thank you, Kate, for the generous introduction. I am a forester and conservationist, work with the URI Department of Natural Resources Science, together with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Rhode Island Resource Conservation and Development Council in supporting a cooperative forestry program in which we support private landowners, land trusts, and others caring for and taking care of forest land in Rhode Island. I also have a private practice called Sweet Birch Consulting, but really looking forward to talking with you this evening about the role of Rhode Island's forests in helping combat and adapt to climate change, since that's an important topic these days. Just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to dive in by providing some statistics that will give you an overview of the state's forest. I want to go through some of the multitude of the different values that our woods provide for us here in this state, and talk about how climate change is affecting these forests and finding that they're under stress. Also talk about different pathways for helping our forests adapt to climate change. And then I'll shift into some practical tips for caring for your woods over the year ahead, whether you're a landowner or somebody who just cares about forests, or you might work with a town or a land trust. And then finally, there will be some time for question and answers and discussion at the end. And before I jump in, just want to give credit to some colleagues of mine who helped provide and develop content, which I'm sharing in this presentation. Maria Genoviak of the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science. They're an organization that's really at the nexus of forestry and climate science. Kate Sales, close colleague, will soon be working for the Rhode Island Land Trust Council, and Andrea Urbano, who is with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So when I speak of Rhode Island's forests, I'm really talking about both the rural and urban forests in the state, although I'm going to be focusing mostly on rural woodlands in this presentation. That's because Rhode Island is the second most densely populated state in the US after New Jersey, with fully 39% of the state being classified as urban land. You can see the urban service boundary shown in gray here on this slide. And I found, during my 13 years living here, that a lot of Rhode Islanders don't know that the state remains 56% forested, more than half. Now, all that forest is not the same. There are a range of different woodland types, with oak hickory being the most common, but there are other important species such as white pine, our state tree, red maple, particularly in wet areas. And there are also examples of rare forest types such as oak holly over in the East Bay and cedar swamps as well. And there are large areas that are owned by the state and conservation organizations that are shown in green on this map. But most of it is held by 38,000 private landowners. Typically, their land is held in small parcels, but the decisions and choices that they collectively make, have a big impact on what happens to the woodlands in our state. Now, most of this forest is highly fragmented by commercial and residential development, roads, and other infrastructure. And on the map, those areas in dark orange are the only remaining unfragmented blocks of forest that are greater than 500 acres in size. And those that are in light orange are those that are at least 250 acres in size. I think it's really telling that half the land in the state is within the length of one football field from a road. And in fact, 90% of the state is within 4.5 football fields of a road. So let's go on a quick tour of some of the most important benefits that our forests provide. One critical role that they play is buffering against the effects of severe weather, because their vegetation holds the soil in place and it helps prevent erosion. And this is becoming especially important here in the Northeast, which is seeing an increase in extreme precipitation events. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later in the presentation. Then in lower lying areas of the landscape, forests help reduce flooding and siltation because they retain water and soil and prevent it from rushing downstream from the upland areas. This is a picture from the severe floods of 2010 in the Patuxent River Valley, which I'm sure some of you remember. And here, some of the natural capacity of the river to absorb water from heavy rains like these was lost during the period of industrial development that took place along the river. More than 80% of Rhode Islanders get their drinking water from public reservoirs, with more than 600,000 being supplied by the Scituate Reservoir. And here, forests are the proverbial sponge that soaks up water and releases it slowly over the course of the year while filtering out nutrients and other chemicals that are harmful to our health. They also help mitigate the effects of both natural and man-made disturbances on our drinking water. And it's worth saying that those who get their water from private wells typically also rely on woodlands for helping filter their water too. We're becoming increasingly aware of the contributions of trees to maintaining healthy human communities in the cities and towns where most of us live, because trees clean the air by absorbing pollutants and they intercept particulate matter. And this slide helps illustrate what's known as the heat island effect. It often occurs in urban areas during the summer, where the presence of parks and street trees and other vegetation can moderate hot temperatures, which are unpleasant for everyone, like a couple of weekends ago, and they can be dangerous to vulnerable populations, including those with respiratory conditions, older people, and very young children. Neighborhoods with green spaces where people want to spend time outside with the people living around them are also conducive to building connected communities that are safer, and they're where people want to live. URI conducted a study that was published in 2016 that found that the forestry and wood products industry contributes more than 4,800 jobs and $716 million to the state economy. That's when you factor in the business that's brought to related industries. This is notable because it's actually a bigger contribution than agriculture when you take out the landscaping industry, which is a somewhat separate entity that's sometimes lumped together with it. Meanwhile, forest-based recreation activities annually contribute nearly $375 million to the economy, and they support another 1,500 jobs. And more than 500,000 people, both residents and visitors, participate in fishing and hunting and wildlife watching activities here every year. The state's woodlands also, of course, provide habitat that supports thousands of wildlife species and close to 2,900 plants. The state has a wildlife action plan, which recognizes 20 different types of forest-dominated habitat that ranges from pitch pine barrens to floodplain forests. And many of the wildlife species depend on having unbroken tracts of interior core forest for their habitat requirements. And this is especially true for the species of greatest conservation need. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the climate benefits of forest. it's important to recognize that forests both store and absorb or sequester carbon. Those are two different things. Storage is the amount of carbon that forests hold in their biomass until it's changed into a different form or released back into the atmosphere. Well, absorption or sequestration is the amount of carbon dioxide that forests remove from the atmosphere on a periodic basis. Forests on productive growing sites with big trees typically store the most carbon. Another way to keep carbon out of the atmosphere is to keep it locked up in long-lived wood products, such as cross-laminated timber buildings, such as a new dorm that's found on the RISD campus, or furniture. Wood building is notable because this form of construction has a significantly smaller carbon footprint than concrete or steel. Data from the U.S. Forest Service shows that the average carbon storage among Rhode Island's most common forest types is about 75 metric tons per acre. If you take all of the forest land in the state into account, that's amounts to about 27 million metric tons of carbon. And another way to express that number in a way that we can somewhat relate to is that it's the equivalent of more than 3,300 Olympic swimming pools of carbon biomass. So let's take a look at where that carbon is stored in the state's forests. Everybody thinks of the carbon in the parts of the trees that you can see, and indeed that is the largest single piece of this pie chart, but it's less than half of the total amount of forest carbon. Because as you can see, significant amounts of carbon are found in the roots of trees, in dead wood, and even in the leaves of the forest floor, in those slices of the pie that are at the bottom of the graph here. And I think an important take-home message is that about a third of the forest carbon is stored in forest soils in our region. That's the brown slice on the chart. And if that's lost, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to replace. Next, let's turn our attention to carbon sequestration. Again, the amount of carbon dioxide that forests remove from the atmosphere. And here in the northeastern United States, forests are generally recognized for their ability to offset 10 to 20% of annual carbon emissions. And the Forest Service data shows that the average sequestration rate for Rhode Island's most common forest types is about 1.3 metric tons per acre per year. In general, rapidly growing younger trees on productive growing sites are the ones that absorb the most carbon. And another way to express that absorption capacity of Rhode Island forests is that they annually offset the emissions of 100,000 passenger vehicles. That's using the EPA estimate for an average vehicle's emissions. Now, there's currently a lot of applied research that's happening on how forest management practices can be employed to enhance carbon uptake and storage. In fact, the New England Forestry Foundation and Harvard Forest have proposed that with better management, New England's forests have the potential to absorb the carbon from all vehicles in New England. That's taking all 6 states into account. So if there's a take-home message or point that I want to leave you with here, it's that the sum of the benefits that Rhode Island's forests provide is greater than any single attribute. Some of us may have a tendency to focus on economics, say, or the climate benefits of forest, but there really are few other resources that provide such a wide range of benefits to all members of the population. Now, especially since they're an important part of the solution for helping mitigate climate change, it's important to recognize that forests are affected by climate change as well. And in fact, climate change is a major stress factor for forests, along with most other types of ecosystems. So let's take a closer look at the impacts here in Rhode Island and southern New England. We all know that the most prominent feature of climate change is warming temperatures, but different parts of the world are affected in different ways. And in the northeastern US, this has seasonal effects. And this is regional data that's from a study that's conducted by Boston University Professor Pamela Templer, and her measurements were conducted in metric units, but some English conversions are added up there on the screen. And her research has shown that temperatures are rising disproportionately in the winter when compared with other seasons. Today, our region has seen an average increase in winter temperatures of 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1950s. And depending on carbon emissions moving forward, climate scientists believe this has the potential to increase another 8 degrees by the year 2100. Now, of course, winter temperatures have a direct impact on snow depth. That's what's shown in the lower graph here. And with warming temperatures, we're observing fewer days with snow cover and less heavy snow cover overall. Compared to 1950, we have an average of 20 fewer days of snow cover per winter, and our maximum depth on average is 10 inches less than what it used to be. Now, at first you might think, this looks good, less snow shoveling and dealing with the hassles of winter weather. But unfortunately, these changes in winter weather are having negative impacts on our forests by compromising their ability to function and provide their full range of benefits. Many scientists have debated whether the increase in atmospheric temperature is going to increase forest productivity and growth or limit it. It's true that these warmer winter temperatures do extend our growing season in Rhode Island, so plants can photosynthesize for more days each year, and that can mean greater growth rates and more carbon sequestration. But however, scientists are finding that the potential benefits of the longer growing season can be offset by increased respiration that's associated with those warmer temperatures. Forests and plants are also more vulnerable to impacts from late spring frosts and soil freezing, which can reduce their productivity. And let's take a closer look at soil frost. Here on the left, you can see a forest with historic, typical winter snow cover, while the forest on the right has no snow cover, which is becoming more common in our warming climate. And when the soil is unprotected by that insulating layer of snow, soil frost can penetrate and cause damage to living things in the soil. Specifically, it leads to root damage, compromised populations of good microbes and bugs, and increased soil respiration. It reduces air and water quality and potential for carbon storage. Templer and her research team found that it could reduce forest carbon storage capacity in the soil by more than 15%, which is really quite remarkable. Frozen soils, due to a lack of snow cover, can also reduce the size of root systems, impede water infiltration into the soil, and lead to more erosion and release of nutrients going into our streams. Another important effect of climate change is that it's impacting our natural disturbance regimes. We can talk about each of these in detail. For this webinar, I'm going to focus on those changes that have the greatest impact on Rhode Island forests. Our forests are adapted to each type of disturbance that you can see here, even tornadoes, and they've played an important role in shaping the characteristics of the forest that we have today. But climate change is altering these disturbance regimes. It's increasing the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events. And along with the human-driven disturbances that we're bringing, such as forest fragmentation, development, and sprawl, this is compromising our forest's ability to respond and bounce back from these disturbances, or to be resilient. Now, while the total amount of precipitation that we receive isn't expected to change significantly, the distribution of that precipitation is, in fact, already changing. And instead of it being spaced out relatively evenly over the course of the year, we're seeing more heavy rainfall events and freezing rain and sleet and snowstorms in the winter. And here you can see how the Northeast stands out as the region of the country that's experiencing the biggest increase in heavy rainfalls. And that 71% increase shown on the map is the increase from 1958 to 2012. which is based on the heaviest 1% of precipitation events over that time period. Now, with precipitation becoming more concentrated, it at first may seem counterintuitive, but we're also likely to experience more periods of drought with little or no rainfall during the periods in between these storms. This aerial photo was taken during the early fall of 2019 when Rhode Island was experiencing an extreme drought. And you can see the leaf dieback in this oak hardwood forest that actually had the effect of limiting fall colors around southern New England that season. And droughts are one of the biggest stressors of forests, and they can often lead to secondary effects of insect and disease outbreaks on trees that are stressed, along with increased fire risk. The effects of drought do depend on a lot of factors, including their length and severity, conditions at different sites, and some tree species are more susceptible to drought than others. Forest pests and pathogens are expected to become more damaging as they're going to be able to adapt more quickly to these new climate conditions, migrate more quickly to suitable habitat, and reproduce at faster rates. And historically, we had consistently cold winters that would kill off insect populations, but less severe winters may enable more insects to survive and spread. The severe gypsy moth outbreak and infestation that we had in the late 2010s is a great example of how insects and disease are becoming more problematic when trees are stressed by other factors. This is a photo of a Rhode Island DEM forester who's giving a tour of a state management area that experienced heavy canopy tree mortality, as you can see over his shoulders here. And we had consecutive years of drought that stressed oak trees and reduced their chemical defenses. And these dry conditions also suppressed a soil fungus that keeps gypsy moth populations in check. And the effect was that trees that were weakened by drought and then defoliated by the gypsy moth became easy targets for a native beetle called the two-line chestnut borer, which in many cases was the agent that actually delivered the coup de grace and killed the trees. And now we have thousands of acres of dead overstory oak trees, especially in western Rhode Island, along the border in adjacent parts of Connecticut and up into south central Massachusetts. Along with insects, it's likely that invasive plants will also benefit from climate change. These are plants that are native to another part of the world, and they can reproduce like crazy without any checks when they're introduced to a new ecosystem. Invasive plants can spread rapidly because they can grow in a wide range of conditions. They can tolerate changed environments and aggressively colonize new areas and outcompete native species. This is a picture of a very aggressive invasive called Japanese knotweed. It was already present, but it spread in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and Tropical Storm Irene. You can see how it can take over when it gets introduced to an open area like this. Growing deer populations are another factor that's influencing the health of our forests. As you know, deer are herbivores, and their preferred diet is the young seedlings and saplings, especially oak trees that represent our future forest canopy trees. And since animals typically eat the plants that they evolved alongside, they usually won't touch invasive plants. White-tailed deer are a native species, but they've adapted very well to how humans have modified their forest habitat, and their populations have grown so large that they can actually inhibit the ability of our forests to naturally regenerate. We think that deer browsing pressure can limit the ability of forests to respond to climate change. We've become habituated to forests like this one in the photo that has an open understory that's easy to walk through, but this can be a problem in the event of a storm or another disturbance when there are no native hardwood trees that are there established growing in that understory, They're ready to grow up into the canopy when there's a disturbance or other trees fall or are removed. Finally, one more striking effect of climate change is that the growing range of different species of trees is predicted to shift northward over a period of decades. And the map on the right here is based on predictions of models that are based on a lower emission scenario. And the higher emission scenario would show even more change from the historic species distribution map that's on the left. Now, in general, species that can tolerate hotter and drier conditions are projected to fare well, while those that are likely to become stressed under these conditions will diminish. And you can see how the maple, birch, and beech forest that's shown in red in the map on the left, which is currently dominant in many parts of the Northeast, is projected to be displaced by the oak hickory forest type that's already the most common in Rhode Island. And this is also expected to play out at a much more fine-grained scale, with various species of trees projected to be so-called winners or losers under these conditions. So we often hear the word resiliency when we talk about climate change. But what does it mean in the context of a forest ecosystem? This is a definition that's provided by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which I think it does a good job of illustrating the concept. It's important to note that disturbance can be caused by human or natural causes. And in fact, this picture is taken 7 years after a careful timber harvest. And you can see different species of trees, ages, and plenty of understory growth in this picture. Next, we'll go into the steps that woodland owners can take to proactively manage and care for their woods over the years ahead. This slide shows 3 broad options that can be applied to many different types of situations to help woods become more resilient and adapted to changing conditions. On the left is what's come to become known as the resistance pathway. And this is the most conservative of the 3 options. Here, the goal is to defend against change and keep conditions as much the same as possible. You're going to try to protect tree and plant species and other resources on the site and keep them healthy to prevent change for as long as you can. You might choose this resistance approach for an area of forest that's valuable and difficult to replace, like a patch of very old forest or a grove of maples that's valuable for producing lots of sap for maple syrup, for example. In the middle is the option that's known as resilience. Here you're trying to allow for the ecosystem to experience some changes while bouncing back to a desired condition. And you can think of a rubber band stretching and returning to its original shape. One example of a resilient strategy is to promote a range of different species and ages of trees in a stand or a whole forest, so you're less vulnerable to big changes when disturbances inevitably come along. Finally, on the right is the transition pathway. This is the most aggressive of the options, and that the goal is to try to help a site or an ecosystem change to become better suited to what anticipated future conditions are like. You might choose this for a site that's especially vulnerable to climate shifts and clearly going to change whether you like it or not. I have found that people often tend to have strong feelings about this option. So what can you do for woods that you care about? We've tried to distill the scientific information about what climate change is bringing into some practical tips to help take care of the land over the years ahead. And these suggestions can apply to a property that you own yourself, or it could be land that's cared for and managed with others, or in a community, such as by a land trust or a town forest property, or indeed a state forest for that matter. I'm going to start with some examples of things you can do to resist the effects of climate change. A lot of longstanding good forestry practices are also climate smart practices, and protecting water and soils is a good example of this. Like other states, Rhode Island has established best management practices for water quality protection, and some of them are required by law. And one of the clearest things that landowners can do to protect water and soil is to establish good roads and trails in your land and keep them maintained. And this has the benefit of improving access to different parts of the property and concentrating impacts where they can be managed and contained. Stream crossings and bridges are important because they're potentially vulnerable locations in storms. You might want to consider installing larger culverts that can handle higher peak stream flows and make sure that bridges can withstand flooding. Having well-maintained stream crossings protects important habitat for fish and other aquatic organisms, and it also protects water quality. I mentioned how invasive plants are likely to benefit from climate change. It's important to be aware of how stresses or disturbance can allow invasive plant populations to come in and become established or spread. One example of this is that invasives will often colonize a cleared or open area, especially if it's located next to a road that can facilitate the spread of their seeds. It's a good idea to become familiar with and be able to recognize our most common invasive plants, such as barberry, buckthorn, bittersweet, multiflora rose, and knotweed. Early detection and action is important because it's much easier to manage and control small concentrated populations of invasives before they become widespread and then become nearly impossible to control without vast inputs of resources. So therefore, I place the highest priority on monitoring for and controlling early stage invaders, even though it can be more difficult to find them when you're out in the woods. Another thing you can do is be aware of what's going on in your woods so you can promote healthy trees and plants. Remember that stress or disturbances from other causes can increase their vulnerability to pests and disease. Sometimes it's a good idea to cut and remove unhealthy trees so that others don't become affected by the same condition. There are specific treatments for different insects and diseases, and reaching out to a professional can help ensure that you're responding in the right way. It's also important to make the distinction between when it may be appropriate to consider individual trees and when a condition needs to be considered at the level of a stand of trees or the whole property. For example, there are times when it may be feasible to treat a single tree or a few yard trees for a particular condition, but it's not practical or economical to do so across a whole property. Now, since sensitive areas and rare species are often particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, it's good to think about where the special areas are on your property or the land you care about. And these may be areas where there are features or species that aren't found anywhere else in the land. It's often where you find water features such as streams, wetlands, and permanent or seasonal ponds. So to protect these rare and sensitive communities, you may want to maintain these areas as unmanaged reserves and keep the roads and trails away from or at the edges of these kinds of places. Now I'm going to shift to some of the things you can do to increase the resiliency of your woods in a changing climate. And I touched on this earlier, but one of the best things you can do is to promote a range of different types or species of trees, and also trees of different ages and sizes. This is a classic example of managing risk by spreading it around, like not putting all your eggs in one basket or having a diversified investment portfolio. So if all your tall trees get blown over in a windstorm or others are killed by an insect or a disease, you have other kinds of trees that can grow in and take their place. One of the most common ways this is carried out is by conducting a timber harvest, and this can be planned to include climate smart practices. It's always a good idea to work with a forester when planning and carrying out a harvest to help ensure that the work will meet your goals for your land and is done in a professional and responsible way. Now, for the future of your land, the trees that remain and continue to grow in the forest are really more important than the ones that get cut. And in general, it's a good idea to keep representatives of less common trees to promote diversity, and tree species that are projected to do well in the future are also good to promote as well. We also want to be mindful of retaining good habitat for wildlife while recognizing that different birds and other animal species have different habitat needs. One of the most common practices to improve the health of your trees is to conduct a thinning. This is when you remove some canopy trees while leaving others that will then have more space to grow and become healthier. And it'll also allow some light to reach the forest floor, which may allow young trees to start to become established there. Another practice that's good for promoting diversity is to create small canopy openings or patch cuts. And this will create gaps that are large enough to allow new seedlings and saplings to become established. And it'll create a cohort of younger trees that will eventually grow up into the canopy. Birds and wildlife tend to be attracted to these openings. So this is something to consider if you like to see wildlife on land that you own or care about. Now, to conclude, I'm going to mention a few things you can do to help your woods transition and adapt to changing conditions. A long-time good forestry practice that's appropriate here is to promote and plant trees that are well suited to the growing conditions at a given site, particularly the underlying soils. Trees that will grow well in moist and wet areas are usually not the same species that will do well on dry and rocky ridgetop sites, for example. Now, with all the variables presented by climate change, it's likely that trees that can handle a wide range of growing conditions will grow better than species that can't. You may also want to consider favoring trees that are tolerant of the hotter and drier conditions that are anticipated in the years ahead. Some landowners may even want to consider planting tree species from slightly further south that aren't currently native to Rhode Island, but are well adapted to these conditions and may be expanding their range northward in the decades ahead. I mentioned the impacts that deer are having on forests by eating the hardwood seedlings and saplings that are our future canopy trees. And this is a tough issue. It's not likely to be resolved anytime soon. But for those who are comfortable with it, hunting is an excellent way to reduce deer impacts. And after that, there are measures the landowners can take to protect young deciduous trees. This could include protective shelters around trees, leaving brush or wood debris as a barrier or a deterrent to deer, or even constructing deer exposure fences in small areas. One of the most important things you can do is just to be out there and spend time on your land, because this is going to help you monitor and notice changes in your woods. Early spring is a good time to be out there because you can recognize invasives more easily because their leaves typically develop early before those of native trees and plants typically green up. And walking your land during or after a heavy rain will help you notice where erosion occurs and where you may see pools of water or sediment entering water bodies. It's helpful to keep records of work that's done on your land, including the details and the date different activities occurred. Photos are valuable as a reference in the future, document how conditions change, and to be able to compare a photo of a site at the present time to what it looked like at past times. Finally, encourage landowners and all of you who are involved with forest stewardship to get assistance from professionals. And you're already doing this by participating in this cooperative extension webinar but I want to emphasize that a lot of people are available and interested in helping you. To get started, you can get limited assistance at no cost from some government agencies. For example, Rhode Island DEM's Serviced Forestry program is dedicated to serving private landowners, and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service offers both technical assistance and financial assistance in the form of cost share funding for private landowners. Consulting foresters and other professionals serve landowners by helping you develop a strategic plan for your land, which has the important effect of that it can help save you money on property taxes. And they'll often work for you in carrying out activities such as harvesting timber, enhancing wildlife habitat, controlling invasive plants, and planning access roads and trails, along with all kinds of other activities. Legal specialists can be useful in helping families plan for the long-term future of their land. And working with a professional, it's usually a modest investment that will save you money in the long run. Now, I encourage you to check out the Rhode Island Woods website, which is listed on this slide. It's intended as a go-to source for contacts and all things related to forests in this state. And the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization, or RIFCO, is the state's forest landowner organization and another good source of reliable information. And RIFCO events also provide a good way to connect with other landowners now that we're starting to do that again as we emerge from the pandemic. So if there's one point that I want to leave you with, it's that in our changing climate, the value of Rhode Island's forests and caring for them is more important than ever because they care for us in return. I want to thank you for being here to participate on this talk on climate change in Rhode Island's forests. Really do appreciate your interest, and I will be here to take and respond to any questions that you may have or discuss any topics of interest. Thank you.
Awesome. That was great, and I loved what you said about forests taking care of us. I wholeheartedly believe that on many different levels. So as someone who spent probably 90 out of 100 days of the pandemic in the woods with my family, this is a very important topic for me. And Chris, we do have some good questions, thoughtful questions that I'd love to pose for you, starting with going back to the beginning of your presentation. There was a question about what the white areas on the map represent. I don't know if you can scroll back to that image, or if you recall just without looking at it. Glenn is wondering.
Sure, I can go back.
Great.
Well, the white areas are forested areas here. So the urban service boundary is shown in gray. That's our developed area. Conserved areas of forest are in green. So that's a combination of state management areas, land trust lands. You can see the Situate Reservoir watershed property, for example. And then the areas that are shaded in orange are our remaining core forest areas. Those that are 500 acres and larger are in the dark orange, and 250 acres and larger are in the light orange. And then in the white areas in between, so you'd have some forest in there, and also I think some agricultural and other lands as well. You know, looking over in the East Bay and places like Little Compton in South County, where we're familiar with the land use, and I think we know that that's represented there too. And water bodies too. You can see that the Situate Reservoir appears in white on the slide.
A lot of forest out there, kind of amazing. So my friend Terry is asking about the Forest Conservation Act that's being proposed. For thoughts about the power of that act in practice to protect forests from something like, for example, solar development, which I know is outside of the maybe the purview of a forester, but just if you could share at all anything you know about how that act was developed, if anyone was called upon from
Sure.
your
I am the co-coordinator of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership, which convenes different organizations and professionals involved with issues related to forests in the state. I think one of the most important points about the Forest Conservation Act is that it would set forth in state statute and recognize the value of forests, which currently aren't recognized. This would put them more on a par with farms in agriculture, which are recognized in this way. And there's there's no new regulation, but it would establish a commission to develop strategies for funding forest conservation and stewardship that's roughly analogous to the state's Agricultural Lands Commission.
So that's good. That's good news. That's really good news. I think, and that's part of the Climate Act, right? That was introduced.
It's its own
Okay.
separate act, though, as we've talked about tonight, forests are a very important piece of the climate resiliency puzzle, together with renewable energy as we consider ways to promote, while also promoting smart siting of renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big topic. There are some other questions here about comparing loss of forests, ecosystem services, and replacing that with commercial solar installation. And I would just say, to not put you on the spot, that there is some work being done at URI on solar siting, the solar siting issue, in the hopes that by kind of taking the pulse on how people value solar siting decisions and different attributes for siting. For example, if folks are willing to pay more to keep forests intact rather than develop commercial scale solar to meet our renewable energy goals, then if we can put a monetary value on that through some economic analyses, we're sharing those with policyholders. So there's a project right now that's led by Dr. Corey Lang in the Department of Natural Resource and Environmental Economics at URI that I happen to be a co-PI on, and my role in it as the extension person is to disseminate the results of his studies. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, I would suggest putting in Forest Solar URI into a search engine, and you will find a website with many reports and resources to that particular point. So I want to acknowledge that this is an issue we're actively looking at, and Christopher, I'd welcome you to share anything else about that, but just in the interest of getting to all the topics, I'm going to shift us to plants in particular. So there's a question about the nativity of the black locust tree, whether or not it is a good species in our area in terms of biodiversity.
Sure. And just on the subject of forests and renewable energy, I just thought I'd mention that GrowSmart Rhode Island, which is a member of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership, has done a lot of good work in drilling down on this topic. And I would refer you to their website and some of their work on this topic in their publications. But turning our attention to the black locust, that's a tree that really falls into the area where some consider it invasive, some do not. I have sometimes seen it on lists of invasive species. I know it's sometimes still planted. I think it depends a lot on the situation in which you're looking to plant. If you're trying to reclaim and rehabilitate a degraded site, or if you're planting out in the woods. I think with species about which there's a question, it makes sense to be conservative and to apply the precautionary principle. But it is a species that can grow prolifically, and it's used for reclamation of mine sites, for example, in other parts of the eastern U.S.
Fascinating. How about Maud, our friend calling in from Block Island of the Enchanted Forest of Block Island, is asking about status of studies, maybe locally finding resistant chestnut tree varieties to reforest with?
Well, the American Chestnut Foundation has been, we're working on this for some time, and I'm not an expert on the chestnut, but this is the species that used to be regarded as the so-called king of the eastern hardwood forest, and was really the dominant canopy tree, which has since been replaced by oaks until being decimated by the chestnut blight in the early 20th century. But they've been heavily involved with breeding and genetic research, and there are hybrid chestnuts that are often a cross between the American and Asian chestnuts that are now being outplanted at orchards and a few other sites in Rhode Island, and hopefully these will be more widely distributed in the future as we see the results of the trials. There is a Rhode Island and Connecticut chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, and there are some orchards in Rhode Island if you're interested in learning more about that.
I'm furiously putting links to all of these things we're mentioning in the chat box for you all. We have actually have some extension programming that's connected to some of those. We fondly refer to these projects as the Chestnut Project, but there is a chestnut orchard in South Kingstown on South Kingstown Land Trust property where they are hoping to find a blight-resistant chestnut. So this is all very locally relevant. Let's see, we have other questions. How about if it were a thing to anticipate climate change like we do with plants, non-tree species, or ornamental landscape plants, anticipating that southern tree species will become more naturalized here? Are there southern tree species you recommend trying in southern New England, or is that messing with nature in a way that isn't appropriate? Do you know what I'm?
Sure. Well, that would be an example of following that transition adaptation pathway that I talked about, and sort of the three different adaptation pathways that you can pursue. And indeed, some forest landowners are starting to experiment with that. I've been involved with a project of that type myself. In general, oak species hickories are projected to do quite well, even though they are affected by the gypsy moth and other agents. You can look to some of the states that are just a bit to the south of us, and the mid-Atlantic. for an indication of what may be coming. There's a great resource called the Climate Change Tree Atlas that's put out by the Forest Service and partners that projects how habitat for different species, tree species, is projected to change under different climate scenarios over the decades ahead, and you could use that to inform species that you would consider. I just want to emphasize that I think that considering the specific site that you're you'd be looking at is very important. And if you're looking at a rocky upland forest, that's quite different from a mesic productive area along a stream, for example, in considering the trees that are growing there now and the ones in the future too. But you'll find a lot of good suggestions there. And promoting a diversity of species, so you have that diversified investment portfolio, as it were, is always a sound strategy.
Yeah, maybe that's the trick, talking about this in terms of business, and maybe that'll help it resonate. I think the time has come for us to value forests the way they deserve to be, but that is my opinion. So this is a really good question from Glenn. He's asking about the benefits of patch cutting and how this is different from or how this might combat the problem of forest fragmentation in Rhode Island. Talk a little bit on that.
Sure. No, it's a good point, or a good question. And if you do some patch cutting, if it is not developed to another land use, it will, in this part of the world, it will return to forest. And wildlife biologists, and those, including those working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Rhode Island, DEM and URI, have recognized that the so-called young forest or early successional habitat type is underrepresented from what it used to be in the forest across the landscape. So species that need that young forest aren't finding enough of it on the landscape. So they're trying to create it in different areas around the state where it's possible to do so, and to have patch cuts of sizes that can benefit some of these species of conservation need. But it's true that different species have different habitat needs, and we need both areas of core interior forest in some places, along with areas of younger forest in others. But I think the most important point would be keeping the forest and not converting it to another land use, however you're managing it.
Mm-hmm. How about, this may be the last question we have. Jan's looking to remove and replace biomass where there are many Norway maples. And she's wondering if there's a tree that can compete with the Norway maple's root system. It's a good one.
Sure. This is looking for a tree that, trying to make sure I understand the question, can compete, with the aggressive Norway maple, which is also an invasive species in our native forest.
Yeah, so I guess the last part of the question was, she's saying, is there a tree that can compete with the Norway maple's root system and grow nearby to help replace them before they're removed? So almost creating a successional kind of situation.
I don't have a sort of specific answer to that question, but trying to plant a a tree species that's, robust and a fast, grower, can always be a good idea. If we're talking about Norway maples, I'm guessing that we might be talking about an urban or suburban environment. Not positive, but species that can, tolerate a bit more pollution or rocky soils. Often do well in urban and suburban settings. And there are also lists of species that are good for planting in these types of situations. In fact, Rhode Island's really become a leader in urban forestry that also considers climate change for the health and well-being of its residents. It is DEM's a partner in a big project now that's looking at doing so in Providence and surrounding areas. So some of those species lists might be of interest to that question.
Yeah, and it reminds me really that in a lot of these situations, and you've mentioned this, that whenever you're installing any kind of plant, the best information is all around you. So if it's, kind of putting the right plant in the right place for the right function, if you're replacing, whether we're talking about restoring a forested ecosystem or putting trees in where they used to be, considering the climate, the soils, that's really what will, I think, contribute to the success of whatever plants you put in, using the surrounding context for hints. We talk about that a lot, actually, in even in gardening, where the information you need is all around you. You just have to look around for it. So Edmund is sharing that patch cutting allowed the American chestnut to reemerge on a land trust property he's involved in, which I think may also be the South Kingstown Land Trust Chestnut Project, as we fondly recall.
Since URI cooperative extension has such a strength in gardening with a master gardening program, I just thought I'd share when people ask me about my work in forest stewardship and what I do when actually out there doing forestry. Sometimes I describe it as like gardening with really large plants, because that's really what it is. Your equipment is different. The plants are very large, but they just like garden plants and flowers, they have different light requirements. Some can grow in shady areas, like the sugar maple, for example. Whereas others, like the chestnut, are pines, need a lot of sun to grow, but they also need nutrients in growing space. So that can be a helpful way to think about it, and also I found to talk about it with other people when trying to bring them into forest management.
That's a good note to end on. I think what we all have in common is we love trees. And so, Edmund is sharing that chestnut reemergence is happening with the Burrillville Land Trust, which is great. It's the polar opposite end of Rhode Island in the Great White North. Thank you very much for sharing that, Edmund. So, Christopher, thank you so much. I'm going to wrap us up here. Folks, if you have additional questions, you can always send an email. I will put the email address to send questions to in the chat. It's just coopx@uri.edu, and we'll make sure that your question gets to the right person. In this case, it would be Christopher, most likely. So if you are enjoying these sessions and you want to take part in more of them, we offer them every other Tuesday through July at this point, 2021. And you can find all of the recorded webinars that we have offered live since May of 2020 on our YouTube channel, URI Cooperative Extension. Until next time, thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Mr. Reilly for sharing his knowledge and passion for forests with us. We're really grateful to have you at URI, and everyone else, until next time, thanks for joining us and enjoy the spring. What's left of it anyway.